On the 30th of October 1938, Orson Welles made his infamous radio broadcast of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds. This broadcast has become part of our cultural canon of myths because of the mass hysteria it caused across the US that night. The New York Times the next day reported that a wave of mass hysteria seized thousands of radio listeners between 8:15 and 9:30 o'clock last night, when a broadcast of a dramatisation of H.G. Wells's fantasy The War of the Worlds led thousands to believe that an interplanetary conflict had started, with invading Martians spreading wide death and destruction in New Jersey and New York. The broadcast, which disrupted households, interrupted religious services, created traffic jams and clogged communal communication systems, was made by Orson Welles, who as the radio character The Shadow used to give the creeps to countless child listeners. This time, at least a score of adults required medical treatment for shock and hysteria. This broadcast has gone down in history as a cautionary tale on the deceptive capabilities of modern technology, as well as a testament to the eternal gullibility of humans. But the truth is that this greatest of fake news stories is actually fake news itself. There was no mass hysteria despite what the newspapers reported in the days following the event. This warping of the truth has so much to teach us that's relevant in the present age of fake news hysteria. In his book Broadcast Hysteria, historian Brad Schwartz talks about his search for evidence of the mass panic that supposedly followed the War of the Worlds broadcast. He went through the archives of letters sent to Welles, CBS and the FCC in the days and weeks after the show and pored over the surveys and academic studies that looked at what the American public made of Wells's prank. What Schwartz discovered is way more interesting and relevant today than the mass hysteria of a gullible public in 1930s USA. The first surprising discovery is that most people weren't listening. Only 2% of the country's radio-owning households were tuned into the station that War of the Worlds was playing on. And because there were explicit announcements at the top of the show and in the middle of the show stating that it was in fact fictional, most people who were listening were well aware that it was fiction. As one listener wrote, "The infernal machines passed within a few blocks of my house, and I didn't think to step outside and see them. After New York was destroyed, we all went to bed." Other people wrote letters to Welles saying that they'd been taken in by it at first, but for one reason or another they realised it was all a spoof. Of course, when the Martians appeared, the horror element became comedy for me and the realisation that I had been had. But obviously there was some seed to this story of hysteria. The story didn't come out of thin air. Before the show was even off the air, the Associated Press had sent a bulletin to newspaper editors saying, "Note to editors, queries to newspapers from radio listeners throughout the United States tonight regarding a reported meteor fall which killed a number of New Jerseyites are the result of a studio dramatization." And from there the story took wings. The salacious story of America's mass hysteria was emblazoned over front pages across the country and around the world. The New York Times ran with the headline, "Radio listeners in panic, taking war drama as fact." Across the Atlantic, the Illustrated London reported that many people who tuned in during the broadcast were convinced that they were listening to the description of an actual invasion of America by Martians. Under the headline, "The End of the World," the Dundee Evening Telegraph of Scotland reported, "Millions of Americans are today still suffering from nervous prostration after the panic that swept across the country last night." While down under, the Australian newspaper The Age reported that never in the history of the United States had such a wave of terror and panic swept the continent. Even the Nazis hopped on the bandwagon and used the story to argue that if Americans fall so easily for a fantastic radio broadcast of an invasion from Mars, that explains why they so readily believe Nazi atrocity tales. Hitler himself cited the supposed panic as evidence of the decadence and corrupt condition of democracy. The seeds of this global news story were close to non-existent. In the thousands of letters to Welles, CBS and the FCC, Schwartz found just 12 from people who said they had fled their homes. Another 13 letters were from people who said they were ready to flee their homes, while another 10 claimed to have suffered heart attacks during the show, though none ever filed a lawsuit. And actually, the only successfully filed lawsuit that came out of this mass hysteria was for a pair of black men's shoes, size 9B, by a Massachusetts man who said he had spent the money he had saved to buy shoes on a train ticket to escape the Martians. Apparently, Orson Welles himself paid for the man's shoes out of his own pocket. So what really happened then? Well, how did this blip become the biggest news story of the century? There are 3 reasons that came together to make this story go so viral. First, the story was just too good not to run with. Secondly, there was the context behind the events of the time. And thirdly, there were hidden agendas bubbling beneath the surface. So the first reason is quite simple and is captured in the Irish proverb that you should never let the truth get in the way of a good story. While the majority of Americans were too incredulous to believe the fake news about a Martian invasion, they were only too happy to believe that most people were stupid enough to believe in an alien invasion. As Rob Brotherton points out in his book on the psychology of conspiracy theories, when it comes to any kind of persuasive communication from commercials and political ads, conspiracy theories and fake news, we have a tendency to think that we are less gullible than other people. But when it comes to messages we agree with, the effect works in reverse. We think we're more open to having our minds changed in the right direction, while other people will stubbornly remain in the wrong. We have a tendency to believe that we are immune to bullshit, and yet open-minded enough at the same time to appreciate good information. Our insistence on this is what makes us so vulnerable. We are only too willing to believe that other people are stupid enough to believe bullshit, but that we are too smart to fall for it. This theme continues to this day. A writer for a New York magazine gathered stories of people transformed by watching Fox News, the conservative news cable channel, as if they were helpless victims of a brainwashing cult. I asked a bunch of people how it felt watching their family members be stolen from them by Fox News, the author tweeted. Doesn't feel great, it turns out. So the first reason that this non-event became a global news story is because of the universal human inability to let the truth get in the way of a good story. We like to believe in the stupidity of others as an explanation for the woes of our world. The second reason is context. You have to ask, why was there any hysteria at all? It isn't normal human behaviour for people to worry about Martian invasions. So what were the exceptional circumstances that led to this event? Caused people to flee their houses and many others to make telephone calls and send telegrams inquiring about this danger. You have to remember that this was 1938. War was in the air. There was plenty of scary news coming out of Europe. Only a few months earlier, Germany had made moves into Czechoslovakia, and before that they had absorbed Austria in the Anschluss. The summer of 1938 has been described as the most dramatic and hysterical period of American broadcasting. Crisis followed crisis, emergency orders, mobilizations, fervent prayers, soaring hopes, and bitter despondency. The fear of surprise military attack on American soil wasn't far from anyone's mind. So when some listeners half heard an unfolding crisis on the radio, it's maybe not such a surprise to think that they might have made calls and sent telegrams searching for reassurance. The truth is that most of the people who called the newspaper switchboards weren't asking about Martians and meteors, but about bombs, gas raids and enemy planes. Welles's production of The War of the Worlds was a match in a fireworks factory. This context is a very important piece of the puzzle when you're looking to understand what happened. It's like considering whether the Black Lives Matter protest would have happened without the pent-up energy of the COVID lockdown. So it's certainly no surprise that people were on edge and easily panicked on the eve of World War II. Third reason that this story took off is that it was helped along by a hidden agenda. This was one reason that makes it so relevant to what we're living through today. At the time of the broadcast, radio was new and there were question marks about it. Most of these question marks, of course, came from the old guard of the newspapers, who had lost out and feared losing out to this new medium. The newspapers were calling for regulation of the radio. In a 2013 article on the endurance of this War of the Worlds myth, the authors wrote, "How does the story of panicked listeners begin? Blame America's newspaper. Radio had siphoned off advertising revenue from print during the Depression, badly damaging the newspaper industry. So the paper seized the opportunity presented by Welles's program, perhaps to discredit radio as a source of news. The newspaper industry sensationalized the panic to prove to advertisers and regulators that radio management was irresponsible and not to be trusted. The newspapers were strongly critical of radio in the same way that mainstream media is critical and fearful of social media and its potential for fake news. For me, it's fascinating to see so many of the same fears and tropes about modern technological innovation being repeated almost a century earlier. There was the same suspicion and question marks about the negative effects on humanity. The Washington Post's headline coined the term radiotic to capture the idiocy that radio was breeding. The New York Post coined the term dialysis, which they defined as a disease of the hand, which makes it impossible for some folks to stay with any one program. In other papers, it's not that the radio makes people stupid, but that stupid people are drawn to the radio. These claims of idiocy and short attention span reared their head once again with the rise of TV, and it's a common trope now in the age of social media and smartphones. The 21st century worries about the power of technology to deceive the stupid are mirrored in the fears of Welles's critics, who wondered how people could trust what they were hearing when special effects, impersonators and other tricks of the trade muddied the waters. How could regular listeners be expected to tell reality from fiction? For some, this meant that the new medium needed to be regulated. The real news story of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds turns out to be the timeless tragedy of humanity. We're willing to be shepherded into certain beliefs because they flatter our own sense of intelligence, and they play into the agendas of those who steer the boat. In a world where free speech is losing its shine, and where the old guard are pushing for regulation and suspicion towards a new medium, it seems like a particularly poignant reminder that there may be eternal aspects of the human landscape at play: judgment and power. That's a far more relevant story for us today than a mass hysteria over the supposed invasion of Martians a century ago. That's everything that I wanted to cover on this episode of The Living Philosophy. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please subscribe if you haven't already. If you have any thoughts, insights or feedback, I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. Otherwise, I shall see you next time. Thank you for watching.